The photograph is faded, its sepia tones softened by more than a century of storage in a dusty attic trunk. A young girl, perhaps 9 years old, sits on a wooden chair in what appears to be a modest parlor. Her hair is braided neatly, and she wears a simple cotton dress with a high collar, typical of the era. In her lap rests a large tabby cat, its fur striped and thick. The girl's hands cradle the animal gently, and her expression is serene, almost melancholic. At first glance, it's a tender portrait of childhood innocence, a girl and her beloved pet, frozen in time. The year is 1911. For decades, this image remained tucked away, unremarkable among thousands of forgotten family photographs. But when a descendant decided to digitally restore the crumbling print, something unexpected emerged from the shadows. What experts discovered would reveal a truth far darker than anyone imagined. Sarah Brennan had inherited the photograph along with dozens of others when her great-aunt Margaret passed away in 2018. Most of the images were standard Edwardian-era portraits. Stern grandparents, wedding parties, children posed stiffly in Sunday clothes. But this one stood out. The girl in the photograph had an unusual sadness in her eyes, and the cat, an enormous tabby, seemed almost too still, as if taxidermied. Sarah worked as a freelance photo restoration specialist, so she knew how to bring old images back to life. She scanned the photograph at high resolution and began the painstaking process of digital repair. First, she removed the water stains and mildew spots. Then she adjusted the contrast and sharpened the details that had blurred over time. As the image became clearer, Sarah noticed something odd. The cat's positioning in the girl's lap seemed unnatural. Its body was rigid, its paws extended at awkward angles. She zoomed in closer. The cat's eyes were open but glassy, unfocused. And there, barely visible beneath the girl's right hand, was a thin wire, taut and deliberate, running through the cat's body. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The cat wasn't alive. It was being held in place by an internal armature, a taxidermy technique common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But why would a child be photographed with a dead, stuffed cat? She examined the girl's expression more carefully. What she'd initially interpreted as serenity now looked like resignation. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying before the photograph was taken. Her hands, though gentle on the cat's fur, were trembling slightly, the blur of motion barely detectable but present. Sarah turned her attention to the background. The parlor was sparse, almost bare. No rugs, no decorative items, just a plain wooden chair and a curtain pulled across a window. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner. This wasn't a prosperous household. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, written in faded pencil, was a single line. Catherine M., Boston, November 1911. Sarah ran a quick genealogy search. Catherine M. could have been any number of girls in Boston in 1911, but the last name on her great-aunt's family tree was Morrison. Catherine Morrison. Sarah cross-referenced the name with census records and city directories from that era. What she found made her hands go cold. Catherine Morrison had been listed in the 1910 census as living at an address that matched the Boston Home for Destitute Children. She wasn't photographed in her own home. She was an orphan, or at the very least, a ward of a charitable institution. Sarah dug deeper. The Boston Home for Destitute Children had a complicated history. On the surface, it provided shelter and education for poor and abandoned children. But reports from social reformers in the 1910s painted a darker picture. Overcrowding, inadequate food, forced labor, and psychological cruelty masked as moral discipline. Sarah stared at the photograph again. The dead cat. The sad girl. The bare room. Slowly, a horrifying possibility began to take shape in her mind. This wasn't a portrait of a girl with her beloved pet. This was something else entirely. A photograph with a purpose far more sinister than nostalgia. The early 20th century was a brutal time for poor children in America. Orphanages and charitable homes, though presented as benevolent institutions, often operated with little oversight and even less compassion. The Boston Home for Destitute Children, founded in 1865, was no exception. Sarah spent weeks researching the institution. She found annual reports published by the home's board of directors, full of glowing descriptions of their work. They boasted of providing shelter for over 200 children at a time, teaching them trades and preparing them for productive lives. Photographs in these reports showed neat dormitories, orderly classrooms, and smiling children engaged in wholesome activities. But Sarah also found something else. A series of investigative articles published in the Boston Globe in 1912, just 1 year after Catherine's photograph was taken. A journalist named Harold Finch had gone undercover, posing as a volunteer, and documented conditions inside the home. His reports were damning. Children as young as 6 were forced to work 10-hour days in the institution's laundry and sewing operations. Meals consisted of watery gruel and stale bread. Punishments for minor infractions included beatings, isolation in unheated closets, and public humiliation. Girls who cried or showed emotion were labeled as hysterical and subjected to even harsher treatment. Finch also uncovered a disturbing practice. The home regularly staged photographs for fundraising purposes. Donors wanted to see happy, well-cared-for children, so the institution would dress up select wards, pose them in borrowed settings, and take pictures that bore no resemblance to their actual living conditions. But there was another, darker use for these photographs. Sarah found a reference in one of Finch's articles to memorial portraits. When a child died at the home, whether from disease, neglect, or abuse, the institution would sometimes commission a post-mortem photograph to send to distant relatives or donors. These images served a dual purpose. They provided a keepsake for grieving families, and they allowed the home to present the deceased child as peaceful and well cared for, even in death. The practice of post-mortem photography was common in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, particularly for infants and young children. Families who couldn't afford professional portraits during a child's life would pay for one final image after death. The bodies were often posed as if sleeping, or in some cases, propped up to appear alive. But the home took this practice a step further. According to Finch's investigation, the institution sometimes posed dead children with objects meant to evoke sympathy and innocence. Dolls, books, flowers, and, occasionally, pets. Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked at the photograph again. Catherine's cat wasn't just taxidermied. It had been dead for some time, preserved and kept on hand for exactly this purpose. And if the cat was dead, Sarah didn't want to finish the thought. But the evidence was mounting. Catherine's glassy, unfocused stare, her unnatural stillness, the rigid positioning of her hands. The way the photograph seemed just slightly wrong, as if something essential was missing. She needed to know more about Catherine Morrison. She needed to find out if the girl in the photograph had been alive when it was taken, or if she, like the cat, had already been gone. Sarah reached out to the Massachusetts State Archives, requesting any surviving records from the Boston Home for Destitute Children. The response came 3 weeks later. Most of the institution's internal documents had been destroyed in a fire in 1965, but a small collection of admission and discharge logs had been preserved at the Boston Public Library. Sarah made the trip from her home in Vermont to Boston, carrying the photograph with her. The library's special collections room was quiet and temperature-controlled, the kind of place where history rested in acid-free boxes and whispered voices. A librarian brought her 3 leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed and brittle. She found Catherine Morrison's name in the second ledger. Admission date: March 14, 1910. Age at admission: 8 years. Reason: mother deceased, father whereabouts unknown, no known relatives willing to assume custody. Health status: poor, malnourished, cough, signs of rickets. Sarah traced her finger down the page, looking for a discharge date. There was none. Instead, there was a note in a different hand, added later, November 9, 1911. Deceased. Cause: pneumonia and complications. Body released for burial at City Cemetery, Plot 47, Section C, Pauper's Grave. Sarah sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. Catherine had died just days after the photograph was taken. November 1911. The same month and year written on the back of the image. She pulled out the photograph and studied it again, under the library's reading lamp. Catherine's pose, her expression, the unnatural stillness. It all made sense now. This wasn't a portrait of a living girl with her stuffed cat. This was a post-mortem photograph, one of the last images ever taken of Catherine Morrison. But why pose her with a dead cat? Sarah found a clue in another set of records: donor correspondence files from 1911. She flipped through letters from wealthy Bostonians who contributed money to the home. One letter, dated December 1911, stood out. It was from a woman named Mrs. Cornelius Whitman, thanking the home for sending a photograph of dear little Catherine and expressing sorrow at the news of her passing. The letter continued. How touching that she was photographed with her beloved pet. It brings me comfort to know she had companionship in her final days. Sarah's stomach twisted. The home had lied. Catherine probably never owned a cat. The taxidermied animal had been a prop, added to the photograph to make her death seem more poignant, more deserving of sympathy, and more likely to generate donations. It was exploitation in its purest form. Even in death, Catherine had been used. Sarah contacted a forensic photograph analyst, a specialist in identifying post-mortem images from the 19th and early 20th centuries. She sent him a high-resolution scan of the photograph. His response came back within 2 days. Based on the subject's skin tone, eye opacity, hand positioning, and overall rigor, this is consistent with a post-mortem photograph taken within 12 to 24 hours of death. The subject was likely posed and propped to appear lifelike. The cat is definitely taxidermied. This type of staged memorial photograph was not uncommon in institutional settings during this period. Sarah had her confirmation. Catherine Morrison had been dead when this photograph was taken, and someone had decided that her death was worth more as a fundraising tool than her life had ever been. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Catherine. Who had she been before poverty and death claimed her? What had her life been like in those final 18 months at the Boston Home for Destitute Children? She returned to the archives, searching for any record of Catherine beyond the cold administrative entries. Most of the home's personal correspondence had been lost, but Sarah found something unexpected: a small collection of children's letters, preserved by a former teacher at the institution. The letters were part of a writing exercise. Each child had been asked to write a letter to an imaginary friend, describing their day. Most of the letters were brief and formulaic, written in careful, obedient script. But one stood out. It was dated April 1911, 7 months before Catherine's death. The handwriting was uneven, the spelling imperfect. It read, "Dear friend, I hope you are well. I am not sick today, so I got to go outside for 10 minutes. I saw a cat in the yard. It was orange and white. I wanted to pet it, but matron said no. She said cats are dirty and carry disease. I miss my mama. She liked cats. We had one named Pepper. Mama said Pepper kept the mice away and was a good cat. When Mama got sick, Pepper stayed with her. I don't know what happened to Pepper. I think maybe somebody took him away. I wish I could have a cat again. I would take good care of him. I would give him milk and brush his fur and let him sleep on my bed. But we are not allowed to have pets here. Matron says I should stop thinking about things that make me sad. She says I should be grateful for the roof over my head and the food on my plate. I am grateful, but I still miss Pepper, and I still miss Mama. Your friend, Catherine M." Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears blurring her vision. This was Catherine, not the tragic prop in a staged photograph, but a real child with real memories, real grief, real longing. She thought about the photograph again. Whoever had posed Catherine's body with that taxidermied cat had probably never known about Pepper, about Catherine's love for animals, about the small kindness her mother had shown her in letting a stray cat into their home. Or maybe they had known. Maybe someone at the home had read that letter and decided that a dead cat would make the photograph more effective. Either way, it was a cruel irony. Catherine had spent her last months in a place where even the memory of love was punished as weakness. Sarah made a decision. She was going to find Catherine's grave. She was going to make sure people knew her story, not the sanitized fundraising version the home had created, but the real story of a little girl who'd lost everything and been exploited even in death. And she was going to make sure that Catherine Morrison's name was remembered, not as a tragedy used to open donors' wallets, but as a person who had mattered, who had loved and been loved, who had deserved so much better than what the world had given her. Sarah located Catherine's burial site in the city cemetery's pauper section. Plot 47, Section C, was an overgrown field at the edge of the grounds, marked only by a few weathered stones bearing numbers instead of names. Most of the graves were unmarked entirely. She contacted the cemetery's administration and requested records for Plot 47. They confirmed that Catherine Morrison had been buried there on November 11, 1911, 2 days after her death. No headstone had ever been placed. No service had been held. She'd been laid to rest in a simple pine box, one of dozens of children from the home buried in that same section over the decades. Sarah wrote an article about Catherine's story, including the photograph and the evidence of its post-mortem nature. She published it on a historical research blog that specialized in uncovering forgotten stories of injustice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, a Boston-based nonprofit dedicated to child welfare history reached out. They wanted to help fund a proper memorial for Catherine and the other children buried in the paupers section. A local historian joined the effort, identifying 37 other children from the Boston Home for Destitute Children, buried in the same plot between 1895 and 1920. In November 2020, exactly 109 years after Catherine's death, a memorial was dedicated at the cemetery. It was a simple granite marker with the names of all 38 children, including Catherine Morrison. Beneath the names was an inscription: "In memory of the children of the Boston home who deserved better than they were given. May they rest in peace, and may we never forget. Over 100 people attended the ceremony. Descendants of other children buried there came forward with their own family stories. A local school teacher brought her class, using the memorial as a lesson about historical injustice and the importance of protecting vulnerable children. Sarah stood at the back of the crowd, holding the framed photograph of Catherine with her taxidermied cat. She'd decided to donate it to a museum exhibit on child welfare in early 20th century America. The exhibit would tell the truth about photographs like this one. Not sentimental relics of a gentler time, but evidence of exploitation and cruelty. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached Sarah. She introduced herself as Margaret's daughter, Sarah's second cousin, whom she'd never met. "My mother never talked about her family," the woman said quietly. "But I found something after she died. A diary entry from when she was young. She wrote about a cousin named Catherine who died in a home for poor children. She said it haunted her whole life, knowing Catherine had been alone and forgotten." The woman handed Sarah a photocopy of the diary page. The entry was dated 1955. "I think about Catherine sometimes. I was too young to help her when she was alive, but I kept her photograph all these years. I couldn't bear to throw it away. She deserved to be remembered." Sarah looked at the memorial, at Catherine's name carved in stone. She thought about the little girl who'd loved cats, who'd missed her mother, who'd been failed by every system meant to protect her. "She is remembered now," Sarah said softly. "Finally, she is remembered." Catherine Morrison's story is not unique. Thousands of children passed through institutions like the Boston Home for Destitute Children in the early 20th century. Many suffered neglect and abuse. Many died and were buried without ceremony or mourning. For too long, their stories were hidden behind carefully staged photographs and false narratives of charity and care. But the truth survives in the details we uncover, in the records we preserve, in the questions we dare to ask. When we look closely at history, we find not just tragedy, but truth. And truth demands that we remember and that we do better.